On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, one of history's most infamous events unfolded in Yekaterinburg, Russia. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries, a brutal act intended to ensure that the Romanov dynasty would never return to power. Overthrown more than a year earlier during the February Revolution, the Romanovs were seen by the Bolsheviks as a dangerous symbol of the old regime. Their execution wasn't just about eliminating a royal family, it was about eliminating hope for a monarchy's return, preserving the fragile legitimacy of the new Soviet order born from the October Revolution. For decades, the Soviet Union denied that the Romanovs had been deliberately killed, allowing myths and legends to take root. The most famous of these was the rumor that Anastasia, the youngest daughter, had somehow escaped the slaughter, with countless imposters over the years claiming to be her. It wasn't until 1989, under Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, that the Soviet government finally acknowledged the truth. The Romanovs had indeed been executed, their remains later verified through forensic evidence. But history invites us to wonder, what if things had gone differently? What if, instead of facing death in a basement, the Romanovs escaped? What if they fled across Siberia, boarded a ship, and found refuge in the West? How would history have changed if the House of Romanov lived on? Let's get into it. So, it's July 1918. The Russian Civil War has begun. The Bolsheviks are tightening their grip on power, and the Romanovs, imprisoned in the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg, face imminent execution, or at best, permanent exile. It's worth remembering that Tsar Nicholas II had once been offered asylum by Britain in March 1917, just after his abdication. Initially, King George V supported the idea of granting refuge to his cousin, but political pressure in Britain, coupled with fears of growing anti-monarchist sentiment at home, forced the British government to quietly withdraw the offer. The Romanovs were effectively stranded. Back in Ekaterinburg, the execution is set for the 9th of July the 17th on orders of the Ural Regional Soviet. But in this alternate timeline, fate, or perhaps human greed, intervenes. Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik commander overseeing the Romanovs' captivity, is approached with promises of immense wealth from Tsar Nicholas II himself, who catches wind of their imminent death a week or so before it takes place, compliments of a pro-monarchist sympathizer. Fearing for his own future should the tides of war shift, and believing that communism might actually not win out against the might of the white forces, Yurovsky agrees to release the family to the Czechoslovak Legion, who has taken control of the Trans-Siberian Railway by this point. Under cover of darkness, the Romanovs are spirited away. They board a secret train along the Trans-Siberian Railway, traversing the vast wilderness of Siberia towards Vladivostok, which, by the time they arrive in August 1918, has been temporarily occupied by Allied powers and other sympathetic groups to their cause. This takes longer than usual, as they're only permitted to travel at night and under strict conditions of their Czechoslovak liberators. Crucially, the Romanovs avoid St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, where fears of a royalist uprising or coup would make their presence far too dangerous. Upon reaching Vladivostok, they rendezvous with British agents and sympathetic members of the White Army. Arrangements are made for their evacuation by sea. Their destination? Initially Vancouver in Canada, a distant land within the British Empire, yet far removed from the political chaos of Europe. Back in Mother Russia, the Ural Regional Soviet, which agreed to execute the Romanovs on their June 29th meeting, is initially disappointed that they escape, and suspect that one of the guards is responsible, and has been bought out by the Romanovs. Yurovsky is immediately suspected, and he too flees from the USSR, and remains abroad for the remainder of his life. Meanwhile, the Russian Civil War rages on. The White Forces, a loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik factions, receive covert backing from foreign powers, particularly liberal democracies like Britain and France, who are eager to see the Bolsheviks overthrown. But the Romanovs? Silent, detached, disillusioned. They refuse to throw their support behind the Whites, viewing them as fragmented, ideologically confused, and half-hearted in their monarchist ambitions. In truth, most white leaders had little interest in restoring the Tsar. Nicholas II had been overthrown for a reason. His return to power would have been politically toxic in both Russia and abroad. Many white generals harbored their own authoritarian ambitions, making a full monarchy restoration both unlikely and undesirable. If anything, the Romanovs' fate mirrors that of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, quietly exiled, living in obscurity, their days of political relevance behind them. By staying out of the fray, the Romanovs likely accelerate their slide into historical irrelevance. Their refusal to back a serious monarchist restoration inadvertently benefits the Bolsheviks, who go on to consolidate power and establish the Soviet Union by 1922, just as they did in our timeline. So, what happens if the Romanovs make it out then? Firstly, the Romanovs relocate to Britain, quietly granted asylum by King George V, their cousin, and a monarch increasingly nervous about his own public image. Their presence is kept discreet, mindful of growing anti-monarchist sentiment and the rise of the labour movement in Britain during the early 1920s. Paris becomes another sanctuary, a city known for its Russian émigré community. But the Soviet Union never forgets. Much like Trotsky in Mexico, the exiled Romanovs live under constant threat. Soviet agents are dispatched, especially after the Comintern is created and begins to pick up steam in the 1920s. Whispers of assassination attempts circulate, and there are several attempts on Nicholas II's life, including a failed assassination in the Parisian arrondissement of Montmartre. As a result, the Romanov security continues to tighten substantially. The family survives these close calls, protected by distance, discretion, and dwindling political relevance. The man who spared the family, Yakov Yurovsky, however, and the one who betrayed his Bolshevik superiors, becomes a marked man, and public enemy number one within the Soviet Union. Without the resources, security, or status of the royal family, Yurovsky likely meets a grim fate, assassinated abroad by Soviet operatives, mirroring Trotsky's own end. But unlike Trotsky, the Romanovs gradually fade from the headlines. Their early years in Britain are shrouded in secrecy to avoid stirring anti-monarchist backlash. Over time, scattered members of the family are allowed to settle in neutral countries like Switzerland or the United States, places without monarchist movements or political stakes in their survival. By the late 1930s, the Romanovs are no longer seen as threats, merely relics of a vanished empire, living quiet, anonymous lives far from the shadows of the Kremlin. By the time World War II breaks out, the Romanovs have become largely symbolic figures. While their connections to European royalty grant them a certain status, they wield no real power. During Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, discussions surfaced about the possibility of installing a puppet government in Russia under Axis control, but these notions are met with skepticism. Hitler, in particular, dismisses the idea, seeking complete domination over Russian territories in alignment with his Lebensraum idea and harboring contempt for any Slavic puppet state. Even the Axis's lack of support for Ukrainian independence movements during this period reflect his disdain. The Romanovs strongly reject the idea as well, and there's little fear that they would consider returning as a puppet regime. When World War II ends and Stalin passes away in 1953, the Romanovs are more relaxed, giving uncomfortable interviews than spearheading any counter-revolutionary movements. The legacy gradually diminishes in the aftermath of global conflict, and the ensuing Cold War further relegates them to irrelevance. As many of the remaining Eastern Europe monarchs are overthrown in favor of Soviet-backed communist dictatorships at the same time, their once prominent status continues to fade into obscurity. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and for the first time in decades, the Romanovs are no longer enemies of the state. Their descendants, most now thoroughly westernized, are permitted to return to Russia. A wave of monarchist nostalgia stirs in certain circles, and discussions arise about the possibility of a symbolic restoration, perhaps even a ceremonial monarchy, akin to the British royal family. However, in 1992, a national referendum takes place, and the outcome is unequivocal. The monarchy belongs to the past. Much like other Eastern European nations that have cast aside their royal families, such as Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, the notion of reintroducing a monarchy garners little support. In Greece, for instance, a 1974 referendum saw over 69% of voters reject the return of the royal family. Russia follows suit, with the people having firmly moved on. Even Romania, with its deeper monarchical history, saw only around 30% support in a 2014 poll for restoring its monarchy. The only European country to have experienced a monarchy's return after a significant absence is Spain, which remains an exception to the rule. There are some Romanov descendants that are permitted to return to Russia, but they are no longer rulers, merely living relics of a bygone empire, more curiosities than monarchs. They wield little power in a landscape filled with oligarchs. Most of the Romanov clans still live abroad. Alexei, the youngest Romanov and the heir apparent by this point at the ripe young age of 88, would have likely succumbed to hemophilia. It's likely that he wouldn't have had any ability to reclaim the throne, and this would have fallen to his oldest son. Let's call him Nicholas III. In any case, the people of Russia would have moved on from the monarchy, and it wouldn't receive more than 20% of support in the 1992 referendum to make Russia a constitutional monarchy. As tensions with the West flare up again from 2014 onwards, particularly over Ukraine, the Romanov descendants find themselves in a precarious position. The ones inside Russia? Quiet, striking a careful neutrality. Abroad? Openly critical of Putin, though mainly because they're surrounded by pro-Western elites with whom they've intermingled and even married, as they've been out of Russia for over 3 generations at this point. Barely any would feel Russian, and even less would speak the language. And that's kind of it. The Romanovs would fade into obscurity and wouldn't really be different from the descendants of any other deposed European monarch family. They'll probably live off their wealth that they accumulated during their rule over Russia, and will still have strong connections to the British royal family. After all, King George V and Nicholas II were cousins. They'd probably just live in Switzerland and tweet anti-Putin tweets. And the mystique about Anastasia? Gone. With time and technology, the family obviously proves their identity. Maybe initially as the Romanovs live in secrecy, there would be rumours, but DNA tests, historical archives, and media appearances settle the debates. So yeah, that's it. If you liked the video, feel free to like and sub, and thanks for watching guys. I'll see you in the next.